I opened my husband's Bible on a quiet Tuesday morning, not because I was suspicious, not because I was searching for answers, not because I believed something terrible was hiding inside it, but because the house felt too quiet. And when a house goes silent like that, after years of routine, it starts to feel like it's holding its breath. And I needed something familiar, something grounding, something that smelled like him, an old paper and certainty. His Bible had always been that thing. The thick leather cover cracked at the corners, the pages thin as whispers filled with underlines and notes from sermons we'd listened to together, and mornings when he would read aloud while I made coffee. I didn't even sit down when I opened it. I stood there, barefoot on the kitchen tile, flipping absent-mindedly until a folded piece of yellow paper slipped out and landed face down near my feet. And I remember thinking how strange it was, because my husband was meticulous about his Bible. Nothing loose, nothing extra, nothing personal tucked between scripture, unless it mattered. And when I bent down and turned it over, my eyes went straight to the date written in his handwriting, today's date, and beside it, only two words written carefully with a pen that had pressed so hard it nearly tore through the paper. Final day. And I laughed at first, not because it was funny, but because my brain refused to accept what my eyes were reading. I told myself it was a sermon note, a metaphor, a reminder about fasting or repentance or something symbolic, because that's what you do when you love someone and your world has been stable for 20 years. You explain away the cracks before they turn into fractures. But my hands started shaking anyway, and I felt that cold crawl up my spine. The one that doesn't come from fear exactly, but from knowing something has already gone wrong and you're just catching up to it. Too late. My name is Eleanor. I am 46 years old. I've been married to Daniel for 22 years, and until that morning, I would have told anyone who asked that my life was ordinary, steady, maybe even boring, but safe. I raised two children who are now grown. I volunteered at church. I hosted dinners. I believed in consistency and commitment and the quiet comfort of predictability. Daniel was a deacon, respected, generous, the man people called when they needed prayer or advice or help moving furniture. He was gentle in public, affectionate enough in private, not perfect, but dependable. And I never once imagined that the most terrifying moment of my life would begin with a Bible on my kitchen counter and two words written in ink. My first instinct was to call him, but something stopped me. A pressure in my chest, a voice I didn't recognize telling me, not yet. Because once you ask a question like that, you can't unask it. And I needed to know whether I was about to step into a conversation or into a confession. So instead, I sat down and read the paper again and again, looking for more words, for context, for explanation. But there was nothing, just the date and final day. And suddenly, every small thing I'd ignored over the past few months rushed forward like it had been waiting for permission. The way he'd started waking up earlier than usual, leaving before sunrise, the way he'd been organizing documents late at night, closing his laptop when I walked in, the way he'd given away his old watch to our neighbor, the way he'd insisted on updating his will last year, even though we weren't sick, even though nothing had changed, or so I thought. I went back to the Bible and flipped through every page carefully this time, and that's when I saw the markings, passages I'd never noticed before, underlined in a different pen, verses about endings, about sacrifice, about preparing for the final hour, about debts being settled and sins being forgiven. And I felt sick, because this wasn't a moment, this was a plan. Whatever final day meant, it wasn't spontaneous, it was deliberate. And that's when the betrayal began. Not because he had done something yet, not because I knew anything for sure, but because he had decided something about our life without me. And that realization is its own kind of wound. I spent the rest of the morning moving through the house like a ghost, touching things, remembering moments, trying to convince myself I was being dramatic. I made the bed, I washed the mug he'd used that morning, I stood in the shower until the water ran cold, and still I couldn't shake the feeling that today was not just another day. At noon, I drove to the church, telling myself I would speak to Pastor Reynolds casually, maybe ask if Daniel had mentioned anything strange. But when I walked into his office, he looked at me with something too close to pity. And that's when I knew I wasn't imagining this. He asked me if Daniel had told me yet, and when I said, "Told me what?" his mouth opened and then closed again like he'd realized too late that he'd already said too much. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. Because betrayal doesn't always come with shouting. Sometimes it arrives in the form of silence, shared by everyone but you. And I left the church without answers, without confrontation, without relief, and sat in my car gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. And I realized that final day might not mean death. It might mean disappearance. It might mean confession. It might mean destruction. But whatever it meant, it had already been discussed, decided, and accepted by people who were not me. And the worst part wasn't fear. It was humiliation, the slow burning knowledge that my marriage, my faith, my stability had all been treated like background scenery to a decision I had no vote in. And as the clock on my dashboard ticked toward 3 p.m., the time Daniel always came home, I made a decision of my own. I would not ask, I would not beg, I would not cry. Not yet. I would watch, I would listen, and I would let him reveal himself. Because people always do on their final day. They just don't realize they're being witnessed. By the time Daniel's car pulled into the driveway, the sun had shifted just enough to cast long shadows across the living room floor, and I remember thinking how fitting that felt, how everything familiar suddenly looked distorted, stretched, darker, like the house itself was trying to warn me. I stayed where I was, seated on the couch, my hands folded calmly in my lap, my face composed, because whatever final day meant, I refused to meet it as a panicked wife begging for explanations. The door opened, he stepped inside, loosened his tie, and smiled at me. The same gentle smile I'd seen thousands of times. And that smile almost broke me, because it told me something important before he even spoke. It told me he thought he still controlled the narrative. He kissed my forehead, asked how my day was, set his keys down in the same ceramic bowl he always used, and I answered him the way I always had. Fine, quiet, normal. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing you can do to someone who is hiding something is act like nothing has changed. He went to wash his hands, and I watched him in the reflection of the hallway mirror, noticing how steady he looked, how unburdened, and I wondered how long he'd been living with this secret, and whether the relief I saw on his face was because he was finally close to the end of whatever he'd been planning, or because he believed he would never have to explain it to me. At dinner, he ate slowly, deliberately, savoring each bite like a man aware it might be his last meal at home. And when I asked if he wanted dessert, he said, "No, thank you," with a small, sad smile. And that's when I decided to test the ground beneath us. I told him Pastor Reynolds had asked about him earlier, just casually, just to see what would happen, and his fork paused mid-air just for a fraction of a second, but I saw it. Because when you're watching for cracks, even the smallest shift feels like an earthquake. He asked what the pastor had said, and I shrugged, said nothing important, and he relaxed again, too quickly, like a man stepping away from the edge of a cliff he hadn't meant to approach. And that was confirmation enough for me. After dinner, he asked if I wanted to pray together, something we hadn't done in weeks, and I agreed, because I wanted to hear the words he chose when he thought he was speaking to God instead of me. His prayer was careful, rehearsed, filled with gratitude and forgiveness and preparation. He asked for strength to do what must be done and protection for those who would be left behind, and I felt my chest tighten because he spoke like someone already gone, like someone writing a letter instead of having a conversation. When he finished, he squeezed my hands, lingered longer than usual, and said there were things he wished he'd done differently, things he wished he'd said sooner. And I looked at him and realized with absolute clarity that whatever final day meant, he believed it absolved him.
He believed that still betrayal. And I was done being the last to know, the last to be considered, the last to matter. That night, after he fell asleep, I didn't lie awake wondering or crying like some stories would have you believe. Instead, I got up quietly, opened his office door, and turned on the lamp. And for the first time in 22 years, I searched my husband's private world. And what I found was not another woman, not an affair, not the cliché sins people expect, but something far more dangerous. Folders, meticulously labeled, donations, transfers, shell accounts, correspondence with legal language so dense it made my head spin. Documents tied to the church, to charitable foundations, to overseas accounts. And slowly, horrifyingly, the picture formed. Daniel hadn't been planning an ending. He'd been planning an escape, not from me, but from consequences. The church had been under investigation, quietly. Donations redirected, funds laundered through missions and relief projects. Daniel wasn't the only one involved, but he was the one chosen to take the fall, the one who would disappear quietly before subpoenas turned into arrests. Final Day wasn't about death, it was about erasure. A final day as Daniel Hayes, deacon, husband, respected man. Tomorrow, he would be someone else, somewhere else, carrying the weight of everyone else's sins with him. Or at least that's what they'd convinced him of. And I sat there in the glow of the desk lamp, realizing my marriage had been collateral damage in a deal made behind closed doors by men who spoke about faith while committing crimes in its name. And the worst betrayal of all wasn't the money or the lies. It was the assumption that I would accept it quietly, that I would grieve politely and move on without ever knowing the truth, because that's what good wives do. They endure, they forgive, they disappear themselves. But they underestimated one thing. They underestimated what happens when a woman stops reacting and starts observing. I copied everything, transferred files, photographed documents, sent them to an email account Daniel didn't know existed. And as dawn approached, I felt calm for the first time since finding that note, because Final Day no longer belonged to him alone. He came downstairs just after 6, dressed earlier than usual, suitcase by the door, and he froze when he saw me sitting at the kitchen table, his Bible open in front of him, the yellow paper placed neatly on top, Final Day facing upward, like a mirror he couldn't avoid. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to justify, but I raised my hand, not angrily, not dramatically, just enough to stop him, and I told him quietly that I knew everything. And the look on his face wasn't anger or fear, it was closer to relief, because part of him had been waiting to be seen. And that's when I told him something he hadn't planned for. I told him today was indeed a final day, but not the one he thought, because by the time the sun set, every lie, every transfer, every name he'd tried to protect would be exposed, and he could choose whether to run alone or stay and face it with me. But either way, the story would no longer be told without my voice. And in that moment, the power shifted. Not loudly, not violently, but irrevocably. Because Final Day doesn't always mean the end. Sometimes it means the beginning of consequences. Daniel didn't sit down after I spoke. He remained standing beside the suitcase like it was an anchor, keeping him from floating away. And for the first time since I'd known him, he looked unsure. Not scared, not angry, but stripped of certainty. And that was the moment I understood something vital. He had believed his role was sacrificial, heroic even, necessary, but he had never once imagined resistance. He had never imagined that the quiet woman who prayed beside him, folded his laundry, raised his children, and trusted his leadership would become the variable he couldn't control. He tried to speak again, softer this time, telling me it wasn't what it looked like, that he'd been protecting the church, protecting families, protecting me. And I listened without interrupting, because when people finally reveal their justifications, they also reveal their guilt.
He told me the investigation would ruin everything, that powerful people had already agreed this was the cleanest solution, that one man disappearing would spare hundreds from scandal and loss. And when he said one man, I corrected him calmly and said one marriage, one life, one truth. Because erasing himself didn't erase what he'd done, it only shifted the burden onto those left behind. And that was when he realized he hadn't been planning an escape. He'd been planning a sacrifice, and he'd chosen me as the altar without my consent. He asked me what I wanted then, his voice cracking like the answer might still save him, and I told him the truth, for the first time in 22 years, without cushioning it. I told him I wanted accountability, not revenge, not drama, not mercy, just the truth spoken out loud with names attached, consequences allowed to land where they belonged. And I watched the conflict ripple across his face, because faith teaches forgiveness, but it rarely teaches responsibility. And before he could answer, there was a knock at the door, firm, official, final, the sound that ends denial. When I opened it, two federal agents stood there, polite, serious, already informed, already expecting resistance, but surprised to find none. Because Daniel didn't run, he didn't reach for his suitcase, he simply nodded, like a man who had known this moment was coming and realized too late that delaying it had only deepened the damage. As they led him away, neighbors peeked through curtains, whispers already beginning, but I didn't cry. I stood in the doorway steady, because grief can wait, truth cannot. Later that day, the calls started, from church leaders, from friends, from women who prayed with me, and men who once praised my husband's integrity. Some asked what happened, some asked what I knew, some asked what I planned to say, and I told them all the same thing, nothing more than the truth. And for the first time, the silence that followed wasn't isolating, it was revealing, because silence only protects those who benefit from it. In the days that followed, the investigation exploded. Names surfaced, foundations froze, accounts, sermons were canceled, apologies issued behind closed doors. But the most unexpected part wasn't the public reckoning, it was the private one. Letters arrived from people who had suspected something but lacked proof. Others confessed they'd known and done nothing. And one letter from Daniel, written from a holding cell where he finally stopped framing himself as a martyr and admitted what he'd done. Not to me, not to God, but to himself. And at the bottom of the page, he wrote that final day meant the end of the lie, the end of the pretending, the end of the version of himself that believed righteousness could be negotiated. And I folded that letter carefully, not with forgiveness, not with bitterness, but with acceptance. Because endings don't always bring peace. Sometimes they bring clarity, and clarity is heavier, but it's honest. Months later, when the trial concluded and sentences were handed down, and the church doors reopened under new leadership, people asked me how I survived, how I moved forward, how I reconciled faith with betrayal. And I told them something simple. Something I wish someone had told me sooner. Faith isn't trusting blindly. Faith is choosing truth, even when it costs you everything. And on the anniversary of that morning, I opened the Bible again, not to search for warnings or signs, but to place a new note inside, one written in my own hand with two different words, not my end. Because final day was never about death or escape or punishment. It was about revelation. And once a truth is revealed, it cannot be undone. It can only be faced. And I faced it, stood in it, and walked forward alone, but not erased, not silent, not sacrificed. Because the final day of a lie is the first day of freedom. And that is something no one can take from you once you claim it.